also the head of department for the Centre of Immunobiology at the Medical School of Queen Mary.
Thanks. And Nahid, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Nahid Chowdhury. Before COVID, I used to be a postdoctoral researcher looking at infectious diseases of the gut in malnourished children. So my work is mainly here in London and in Zambia. And of course, during COVID, we've all started working on COVID. And I was testing or evaluating different test devices and then trying to monitor the antibodies or the immune response in healthcare workers. Since the beginning of this year, I'm project managing a collaboration of different universities looking and trying to eliminate hepatitis C in Pakistan.
Thank you. And Neil, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Ed. So my name's Neil McCarthy. I'm a person who's interested in the immune response at mucosal sites, and that means tissues like the lung and the intestine. And I'm interested in how we keep pathogens out on the other side of those tissues.
Brilliant. And Nita?
Hi, I'm Nitul Samaria. I'm a scientist at Queen Mary University. I work on how T cells develop. These are specialized immune cells. And more recently, we've been looking at how you can develop an immune response to SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19.
Thank you. And Jason?
Hi, my name is Jason Lee. I'm a postdoctoral scientist in the Center of Immunobiology at Blister Institute. My background has been studying the antiviral responses in terms of HIV and drug-resistant hepatitis C virus. Recently, I have been involved in the COVID study, as well as my normal research activity, which is to look at the significance of our genetic polymorphism in our immune response.
Thank you. And Louisa?
Hi there, my name is Louisa James. I'm a lecturer in immunology at the Blizzard Institute, which is part of Queen Mary University of London. So my research work is looking at a type of immune cell called the B cell, which is the cells that make antibodies. And so I've been mostly working at home, like lots of people, for the last year, but have been involved in analysing some data from COVID studies looking at antibody responses in patients who've had COVID.
Many thanks. So now you've met the panel. So in terms of asking your questions to the panel, if you send your questions via chat to either Engage at Queen Mary or to me, Ed Stubbs, then we can see them on the chat and then ask them one at a time. We've also got some that have been emailed ahead, so we'll be interspacing your questions with some of those. Before we get going though, I was going to ask Dan, would you be able to just explain a bit about kind of how a basic understanding of how the immune system works and how vaccines work, and then we'll get started with asking people's questions.
Certainly, Ed. I mean, I think the first thing before I do that, I just want to say, you know, we've all been, all the people on the panel have been involved in some COVID research in the last year. Some a lot. For example, Jason's been taking samples right from the very first cases, and we've worked on very different aspects of COVID, trying to understand how it's causing disease and how we can treat it. And we've also been involved indirectly in assessing how the vaccines are working. And I think one of the things that we've been acutely aware of as a group of scientists is that there's quite a lot of misinformation on things like social media, and actually even on sort of mainstream news channels. You can often get quite distorted messages. So we thought that this would be a useful exercise to try to address some questions directly to you guys out there, rather than through all of these different sources, which is a bit like Chinese whispers. Things can get easily misconstrued. The other thing I think we should perhaps just say is that, as you probably gathered from our introductions, we are not clinical doctors. Even though we work in a hospital setting, in an institute where we have a lot of samples coming from clinical patients, we are ourselves not clinical doctors. And so we are not going to really address questions which involve individuals' cases. and their health conditions. What we would say is, they are important questions, but we would advise, questions like that, you should in the first instance, you contact your GP, of course. And if you have underlying health conditions that you're already being treated for, you probably under the advice of a specialist consultant or something, and you should direct your questions at them. So we won't be addressing those sort of individual questions about health. So, okay, so to kick off, the immune system, I suppose, if you are to be making decisions about vaccines, about to take vaccines and trying to, understand why you should be taking the vaccine, you really should have a good understanding of how the immune system works. And I think one of the things that comes across to us as immunologists when we see the immune system talked about on the news and on social media is that actually quite a lot of people don't really understand how the immune system works. So we thought it might be useful to kick off by trying to explain in quite basic terms how the immune system functions, and then we can sort of maybe see how vaccination then helps the immune system to function better. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to try to do that. Hopefully that will work, but obviously you can ask questions based on what I'm about to say. So what does the immune system do? Well, of course, it keeps us healthy, and it keeps us healthy in the onslaught of infections from a whole range of different bugs, for want of a better word, that would like to live inside us. Now, that includes bacteria, of course, viruses like the pathogen which causes COVID-19, it's a virus, but also it can include things like parasites and worms and even fungi. And so your immune system is essentially there to keep you healthy from these infectious attacks. The immune system itself, it's comprised of white blood cells. I'm sure you've heard of white blood cells. You've got red blood cells carrying oxygen. You've got white blood cells, which are essentially the cells of your immune system. And you have literally millions and millions of these cells in your body. And you make them continue, you made them from before you were born, and you continue to make them right up until you die. And these immune cells, you might have heard of them referred to as T cells and B cells. They're the ones that we're sort of going to be talking about in this session. These immune cells, they're very good at recognizing bugs, virus, bacteria, etc. And when they recognize bugs, they can do something to either kill the bug or get rid of it or whatever. But the immune system has a problem. And this is the real sort of crux of it and why we get ill. The immune system has the problem that it doesn't have a crystal ball. It doesn't know in advance which bugs we're going to be infected with. I mean, that's largely dependent on where we are in the world, our stage of life, etc. So the immune system doesn't say, right, I'm going to have some immune cells that recognize measles and some that recognize chickenpox and some that recognize influenza and some, it doesn't know that. So it has to come up with a solution to sort of overcome this problem. So what it does is it makes all these millions and millions of immune cells, and each one of the ones that it makes has a slightly different ability to recognize a bug or something out in the environment, which includes the pathogens, the bugs that are going to infect us. So it makes all these different cells. Now you can probably immediately think of, see the problem that if you're making so many different cells and all of them have a slightly different ability to recognize something, you might find that actually only a small subset of those are actually going to recognize pathogens and therefore will be useful in keeping you healthy. I mean, a lot of them might just recognize bits and pieces of the environment, and it's not really that important that we have those cells. And you can think of it very much like if you came across a door with a lock, and you said, right, I need a key to open this lock. Now you could say, well, if I made 1 million keys and they're all slightly different, and I tried them all, sooner or later I'm going to find one that fits and I can open the door. And it's very much like that with the immune system. Your immune system makes loads and loads of cells, each with a slightly different way of recognizing something in your environment. And really, just by chance, you'll soon find that you have an immune cell which recognizes specifically, for example, the virus that causes COVID-19. Okay, so that's how your immune system is set up. But again, you're probably thinking, well, there's a problem here, right? If you have all these cells, you can't possibly have that many which recognize, let's say, the virus that causes COVID-19. And that's true. We probably, all of us, we probably only have somewhere in the region of a few hundred to maybe 1,000 of these white blood cells which specifically recognize the virus that causes COVID-19. And they could be spread around our body. So when we are infected with that virus, the first thing the immune system has to do is find those white blood cells that specifically recognize COVID-19. It's a bit like you hunting for that one key in the big pot of 1,000,000 keys in order to open the door. It takes a lot of time. It takes a while. Now, the immune system is very efficient at doing this, and it actually only takes a few days, but it does take a few days. And then there's another problem, of course. If you've only got 1,000 cells, that's not a lot of cells to do very much with. You know, the pathogen, the virus, isn't just sitting there saying, you know what, guys, you find your cells, you sort your cells out, and then, you know, give us a shout when you're ready, and we'll have some sort of fight. No, of course not. The virus is doing what viruses do, making many, many copies of themselves, infecting cells, damaging tissues, damaging, in this case, the lungs, and causing disease. What the immune system has got to do when it's found its, say, you know, 500 to 1,000 cells which can recognize COVID-19, it's got to make a lot more of them. It's got to make lots of copies. So it'll induce these cells to divide into 2, into 4, into 8, into 16. And actually, over a number of days, maybe a period of a week, you go from having a few hundred, maybe 1,000 cells to many millions of these cells. And now, of course, you've got something you can actually fight the virus with. And so then it's a race against time. Can you make enough of these very specific cells so that you can fight the virus, clear it out of your body before there's been enough, you know, there's enough destruction that's occurred that ultimately you will die. And unfortunately for COVID-19, in many cases, the people who make their immune response against COVID-19, they just don't make it fast enough. And so they don't make those sufficient numbers of cells in order to fight the virus. And the virus has already damaged the lungs significantly. And unfortunately, those people have died. So this is a big problem. It's a problem with all diseases. Can we find these cells quickly enough? Can we make enough of them quickly enough to stop us getting serious illness and dying? So in that context, where does the vaccine fit in? Well, of course, if you think about this as a problem, you'd think, well, wouldn't it be good for the sake of the immune system if we could identify those useful cells that would be those 500 to 1,000 cells beforehand, before we ever see the virus? If we could just identify those cells and we could start that process of making copies of them, if we could do that first and actually make lots of these copies, then when the real virus does infect you, you've already got lots of cells that can already start to fight. And that's exactly what the vaccines do. So the vaccine is just supplying a component of the virus or a component of whatever bug you vaccinate. And in this case for COVID-19, it's the spike protein, which is one of the proteins that sticks out of the surface of the virus. And the vaccines, all of the vaccines actually that we have, whichever company's making them, they're just supplying this spike. It's an example of a protein, example of a part of the virus. And that's picked up by the immune system. The immune system says, right guys, who recognizes this spike protein? Okay, you. Let's get going. Let's start dividing. We're going to have lots and lots of division. We're going to have lots and lots of cells dividing. And then the immune system says, right, well, now I've got lots of cells. I'm going to spread them around our body. I'm going to send some to the lungs, some to the gut, some to the, some to the skin, whatever. And so that they're all in place with a sort of a heightened ability to react. And so that if then the real virus comes in, instead of having to hunt for those cells and then wait all this time to make lots of copies, you've got all these cells around your body that are ready to react quickly. Now, the only, you say, oh, what about this vaccine, this different vaccine? The only difference between the vaccines is really the delivery. How do we get that spike protein or whatever protein we use to vaccinate? How do we get it to the immune system? Because if we just inject it into somebody, it's very quickly degraded and it doesn't work. So what different vaccines have different ways of actually of getting that spike protein, in this case, towards the immune system. So I think it's quite useful to sort of think of the immune system in this way, and that's what the vaccine's trying to do. Now, you just to finish with Ed, because I think this is a question that did come up from one of the email questions that came in earlier. The question came up, and which was, if I've already had COVID, should I get a vaccine? Is that going to be useful? And it is very useful if you've already had COVID. Can everybody still hear me? Yeah. So it's very useful if you've already had COVID to have first jab. It's also, if you've had the first dose, it's very useful to get the second dose. Why is that? Because each time you get exposed to the bug, if it's through the vaccine or in sort of the real whole thing, your immune systems notch up another level. They become much, much better. And so the more exposures you get, the better your immune system functions. So it's very important to get that process going over and over again. So Ed, back to you. I've said quite a lot already, and we can get going with some questions perhaps.
Well, no, thank you very much for introducing and just saying kind of, both how vaccines work and how the immune system works. So going on from that, go straight in. So first question is from Khadija. She says, could you tell us whether we should be worried about blood clots? I'll open up to the panel. So I think Louisa, that's up your street. Maybe you could talk about
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Okay. So we know now that yes, there has been a very small number of cases of people who've received the COVID vaccine and then have gone on to develop a very rare form of blood clot. This is a very unusual blood clot. It's particularly rare, which is how I think how we know now that yes, it most likely is associated with some kind of a side effect of a vaccine. So it seems, because these cases are so rare, so we're talking about, a few tens of people in the UK, in the context of, having, I don't know how many millions of people have actually now gone on to receive this vaccine. But because it's so rare, there's not a huge amount that we can tell about what's driving the blood clots at the moment. But it does seem to be associated with some kind of adverse immune response. And it's also definitely associated with what we call the adenovirus vaccine. So in the UK, currently we're rolling out two different types of vaccines. One is this mRNA type vaccine, and one is this adenovirus vaccine. So the adenovirus vaccine is the AstraZeneca vaccine rather, and it's that one that's been associated with this small number of these blood clots. So there's evidence that that it's associated with this vaccine. But I think we can be reassured that these are very, very rare occurrences. There is ongoing work into understanding who might be susceptible. So at the moment, it looks like it's generally affected. The people who've been affected so far are generally younger individuals under the age of 30 on the whole. It seems to be affecting women more often than men. So at some point it may be that we can actually identify who might be at risk of these types of blood clots. And obviously there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment to sort of work out the best way to treat people who experience those. In terms of whether you should worry, it's obviously a difficult question, but I think, as I said before, this is a handful or a few tens of cases, in the context of millions of people who've had the vaccine, and to sort of put it into perspective, based on the numbers so far, the sort of the risk of developing this type of blood clot after your AstraZeneca vaccine is about 1 in 200 to 1 in 200,000 to 1 in 250,000. and to put that into context of some other things that kind of increase your risk of blood clots. So the contraceptive pill, for example, can cause blood clots in women who are taking it, and that occurs at about a rate of 1 in 1,000 women a year. So that's that's actually considered by the NHS a kind of a very rare side effect. So you can see that with what we're talking about in terms of the AstraZeneca vaccine is incredibly rare. Smoking, for example, causes blood clots in kind of 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 people. And severe COVID actually is a very it's well established that one of the complications of severe COVID, so people who are hospitalised with COVID, is usually the more typical blood clots that are much more common, and those occur in 1 in 6 to 1 in 7 people who've had COVID. So I think from that you can say that the relative risk of things that we might do every day in our lives is much lower with this in terms of taking this vaccine compared to sort of some of the things that we might do in our everyday lives.
Oh, thank you very much. It's quite interesting, isn't it, when you put it in perspective, giving some other things that are obviously more risky. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. So the next one is from an individual called Mark. He says, how do we know that the current vaccines work on the variants we've seen coming from other countries into the UK? So yeah, how do we know current vaccines work on the variants? And I'll open up to the panel again.
Neil, you want to have a go with that?
Sure. Yeah, very happy to. And yeah, really good question. And the answer, I guess, is that we're testing it constantly. So you've probably already realized that there's a huge amount of research going on into how the immune system responds to COVID. So we've got a lot of information from the studies we did very, very early on, those original versions of the virus that came from Wuhan. We know a lot about that. And we're constantly testing the immune system against all these new variants as well. So there's research going on into this constantly. And so far, the news is pretty good, actually. So some of these variants might be able to spread around a little bit better, a little bit worse, some of them, but there's not much sign of them causing more severe disease. And actually, this is all very consistent with what we know about how the immune system works and how it deals with viruses and what the viruses do in respond to that. So we're very used to viruses essentially sort of changing shape very slightly over time as they sort of interacting with the human immune system. And what that means is some of the time the virus will change shape in a way that means it's better able to sort of avoid being stuck to. So antibodies that you'll have heard a lot about, these little Y-shaped proteins, they're very good at sticking to viruses and essentially gumming them up and making them make it very difficult for them to interact with human cells. And what we've seen so far is that some SARS-CoV-2, that's the name of the virus, some of the variants that we've seen have changed shape a little bit and maybe a little bit better at avoiding antibodies, sticking to them. But they're still having a very, very hard time dodging the rest of the immune system. So as Dan's introduced at the start, the immune system has a huge number of different cells, all doing different jobs in different ways in different parts of the body. Pretty much everyone on the panel has got a different type of immune cell that they work on and spend most of their time researching. And so far, the information we have suggests that these SARS-CoV-2 variants are not very good at dodging all of these other types of immune cells. So they may be doing a slightly better job of escaping from antibodies, but all these other kinds of immune cells are finding them and detecting them just fine. So what we might find down the line potentially is that these variants will become a little bit more common in out and about in the population, because we've done a really good job of getting rid of the primary version with our vaccines. But it's quite likely, I think, that these are going to cause much, much milder infections because the rest of the immune system has been trained and it's sort of combat ready. You've used a vaccine to fill up all of your body tissues with immune cells that are ready to fight it. So even when these new variants come along, we've got a whole bunch of other kinds of immune cell that are primed and ready to go. And in fact, now that we have these new vaccines available, it's going to be pretty quick that we can update those and change the recipe a little bit. So it may start to look a little bit like seasonal flu, where people will occasionally need to go and get an updated vaccine that will protect you against the new flavors of virus over time. But actually, I'm pretty optimistic about it. It's just, I can understand why people find it scary, because when people are talking about variants of concern and you hear about them on the news all the time, it's natural to be a bit worried about it. But what you should actually recognize about that is that shows you how much effort's being put into tracking, monitoring and researching all of this every day.
Ed, maybe I could just add to that answer. I think the other thing perhaps to comment on is that when you look at the variants and you see how they've changed, they're all actually changing in quite similar ways. And that suggests that the virus doesn't have a lot of options when it's changing. It suggests that most of the random changes that the virus has are actually quite detrimental to the virus. They don't allow it to infect people well or quicker or better. And so they sort of slowly die out naturally. And in fact, there's very few ways, it seems at the moment, that the virus can change, and they're all sort of changing in the same way. So that sort of, that's quite encouraging as well, because it sort of says the virus doesn't have a lot of options. And actually, if we can sort of block that pathway off in that sort of direction of change, which we can do with sort of new updated vaccines, probably from the autumn onwards, then we should be quite confident that the virus doesn't have too many other places to go. But of course, it's understandable that we keep on top of them, we monitor them. The UK has a fine record in actually identifying these different variants. It's something that the UK has done quite a lot of. So it's understandable that we're monitoring them and we're just keeping on top of them, seeing how they're changing. But so far, I agree with Neil. The immune system is multi-layered, and okay, you can perhaps get past the first line of defense, but there are plenty of other backups there that should kick in, and it's really difficult for this type of virus that's changing relatively little. It's not like influenza, for example, or HIV, which has a very, very high mutation rate. It's changing, it's changing, but it's not changing hugely. And I think the immune system is more than able to cope with that change.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm just aware as well that we're already halfway through time, so we'll try and move on to a few more questions. So a question from Anonymous so it says, do vaccines work just as well in ethnic minorities or for ethnic minorities? And do they have any kind of different ingredients in them?
I think that's definitely one for Nittel.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for the first part, do the vaccines work equally well in ethnic minority groups? The answer is yes, they do. The clinical trials had a mix of people from different races, and there's no indication that the vaccines work differently in people of different age or race or gender, etc. So absolutely, the vaccines work. In terms of what the vaccines have, well, the main active ingredient would be a very small, harmless form of the virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. And then it has water. It will have preservatives that you would normally find in foods, for example, just to stabilize and preserve the vaccine for storage and for transport. So there's, and any other sort of trace elements that you might find naturally in the body can also be found in the vaccines, but nothing, sort of untoward would be present in the vaccines.
Thank you very much, Nittel. Okay, next question. This is a question from YouTube. We don't have a name. How many people need to be vaccinated in the UK for the vaccine to actually stop the virus spreading? Again, I open up to the panel. Does anyone want to take that question? So how many people need to be vaccinated in the UK for the vaccine to actually work to stop the virus spreading?
Maybe I can fill that one. I think, so what we're talking about here is herd immunity. And that's the concept that actually in a population of people, not everybody has to be vaccinated, or not everybody has to have been exposed to the virus and had an infection for the population to be generally protected. And I'm sure everybody's now aware of this, this R number that we seem to be talking about online, on the news all the time, which is essentially the number of people. If you're infected, how many people do you spread it onto? And of course, if you spread it onto 2 people, then the infection spreads around. And if you only spread that to, on average, half a person, so you need 2 infected people to get another 1 person infected, then essentially the infection dies out. And the idea of herd immunity is to try to protect, either naturally by infections or with a vaccine, to protect enough people so there aren't enough people around that can get an infection to then spread it on. Now, what is this is the $1 million question, actually. Whoever asked that, what is the figure? Well, you actually don't really know until you've actually really gone through a pandemic or an epidemic or whatever. You just don't know what that is. Generally speaking, it's sort of upwards of 80–85%. I think we'll know what that figure is when we get there. We will get there at some point, but I think it's the general thing is that the more people get vaccinated, the quicker they can get vaccinated, the quicker we'll get to that point, and that's when the virus won't have anywhere to go. It won't have enough people that it can infect so that it can maintain an infection through the community.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Next question. Why is it that COVID affects individuals from ethnic minorities more? And that's again from Anonymous. Why is it that COVID affects individuals from ethnic minorities more?
Naheed, maybe you can take this one.
That's a really good question, and something that we've been hearing about in the news for a very long time. So the Office of National Statistics has shown that Black men die at a greater rate than people who are white men. Obviously, over time now, we now see that gender actually isn't a problem, it's actually your ethnicity. And this could be for a number of reasons. So people from ethnic minorities, they have very front-facing jobs, so they're in the public more. So they may be bus drivers, taxi drivers, they work in shops, they own shops, they are doctors and they're nurses, so they're more exposed to the virus. Also, we have underlying health issues too. As an Asian going through Ramadan, I like to eat sweet dishes at the end of my fast. So we all have, a number of us will know people who are diabetic, we have coronary heart disease, and we have lots of underlying issues. So these really increase the risk of catching COVID. And that's really at the moment all we know. We don't actually know if there's any genetics, which perhaps is not really the case involved, but we certainly know that there is a difference between ethnicities and the rate of COVID infections. That's really all I can say at the moment. We just don't know.
Thank you very much. So now we have a question from Lorna on Zoom. Please, can you explain how antibody-dependent enhancement / pathogenic priming is not the same as an autoimmune response? If the cells are expressing the mRNA spike protein, is this the case that the immune system mounts a response to the person similar to type 1 diabetes / beta cells? Very concerned about type 1 diabetes. She also says, and if the mRNA is instructing the cells to produce the spike protein, how or when does it cease? Or will our body be a spike protein manufacturer indefinitely? So that's the question. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I'll hand it over to the experts to try and answer. Help.
Does anybody want to have a go at answering that? Louisa?
So to answer the first part of the question, so antibody-dependent enhancement was the question about the first part. So that is a phenomenon that occurs with some viruses that are very similar to each other, and that can infect immune cells and propagate in immune cells. So the way that works is that if you make antibodies that recognize a particular structure on a virus, those antibodies in certain diseases, so things like dengue fever, can stick to the pathogen, the virus, And as Neil alluded to earlier, I think that that complex, that mixture of the pathogen and the antibody can be taken up by other immune cells as a way, as part of the immune response, the natural part of the immune response that's clearing it. Now, if that virus is able to grow inside an immune cell, then that can actually propagate an infection. If you have a particular type of antibody that can bind and enter an immune cell, and then that virus can. So that's the case for a small number of known viruses like dengue. It's not the case for coronavirus, and so there's no concern about antibody-dependent enhancement occurring in the context of either natural infection or vaccination. And then the second part of the question was about autoimmune disease. Is that right? Could you repeat the question, Ed? Sorry, the second part.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, the second part. If the mRNA is instructing the cells to produce a spike protein, how or when does that cease? Or will our body always be making those spike proteins?
Yeah. So again, another good question, and if I'll attempt to answer it if anyone else wants to jump in. So that's a transient response, essentially. So what's put into your body with an mRNA vaccine is RNA, and that's relatively rapidly degraded by the immune system. So it's not something that's permanently, it's a temporary thing. You make enough of it that your immune system can respond to it, but it doesn't stick around. I think Neil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to just add to what you'd already said, Louisa, that we know these RNA molecules, they break down really, really fast. And actually that's a problem most of the time, because our vaccines are made out of them and they don't hang around for very long. So that's why we need several different types. So there are parts of the world where we can't keep RNA vaccines very, very cold. So it's difficult to get them to the places that they need to go. So at the minute, a lot of the RNA vaccines are being stored in hospitals where they have big, very, very cold freezers to stop them from falling apart. Once they get into your body, they start to fall apart very quickly indeed. For some of our experiments, it would be quite nice if it hung around longer, but it tends to break down very, very quick, which is one of the reasons why we need lots of different flavors of vaccine.
Thank you very much. Our next question, we're getting lots of questions.
Ed, I think Jason wanted to add something.
Oh yeah, please do, Jason, please do.
Just to support the information that Louisa and Neil has given. So for example, for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which is an mRNA-based vaccine. So scientific studies have shown that following vaccination, these mRNA molecules can be degraded as fast as 24 hours within our body, which has given enough time for these mRNA to be translated into the spike protein, which is generated by our muscle cells at the injection site. So this is not going to cause a permanent production of the spike protein in our body.
Thank you very much, Jason. That sounded a really comprehensive answer, and even someone like me could get a bit of that. So thank you very much to our experts. Next one is from Sharon from London. Hi all. I wondered as there are recent worries and concerns around the links between women's fertility to the Pfizer vaccine. Do we have any info on this as of yet? And do we know enough about side effects or risks to women's reproductive health to be offering women of childbearing age the vaccine? Is it safer to wait till we know more? There are also concerns linking miscarriage to the vaccine. Do we know yet if there is any tangible link between the two? And that's from Sharon from London. I'll open up to the panel again.
Nicola, I think.
So I can attempt to answer that question. It's quite complex, but so the short answer is that the vaccines do not cause infertility. In fact, when clinical trials were being conducted, they found that participants from both the control and the vaccine groups fell pregnant in equal numbers, so similar numbers. There was no sort of imbalance in that sense, and in fact I think the current it's just been sort of come through. The policies changed on pregnant women getting the COVID vaccine in the UK now. Someone can add to that if they know more details, but there's been no concern in that sense in terms of infertility. And in terms of pregnancy and getting the COVID vaccine. This is monitored very closely. In fact, in the US, there are trials being conducted currently with the Pfizer and the Janssen vaccine with pregnant individuals. So yeah, this is going to be monitored very closely as well. But so far, there's nothing to be concerned about.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Maybe I could just add something to that point. I think it's a really, it's a really good question actually, because I think it also sort of speaks about a general question about vaccines. Have they been rushed? And I know, Jason, you might want to say a few words on this, Jason, because it's something that you've looked into quite a bit about, have vaccines been rushed through trials? Have they been tested properly? Jason, you want to say something, or yeah?
Sure. So as we know in history about vaccine development, usually clinical trials include three phases of clinical trial before a vaccine can be monitored and approved by medical authorities. So usually this whole process takes 7 to even 10 years. For COVID vaccines, we know that they have been expedited in the context of 9 months that we have vaccines being rolled out and authorized by our authority. So this is a relatively quick process, but we do not forget the fact that during the vaccine development, there are lots of situations that are being different from other vaccine developments in the past. First of all is the urgency of the situation. COVID-19 is a global pandemic that has been causing a lot of serious illnesses, hospitalizations, and unfortunately deaths. And this is a problem that has to be dealt with relatively very quickly. Secondly, there has been a huge amount of funding being available internationally to support not only the clinical studies, the clinical trials, as well as the production of the vaccines. And thirdly is the focusing of mindset on this urgent global pandemic. All the international agencies, all the international scientific communities are working all together to accelerate this process. And importantly, because of this international collaboration of not only scientific but also political communities, we have avoided a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy in this process. And as a result, a lot of the dead days, what we call dead days in this process of clinical trials and vaccine approval, can be removed during the development of COVID vaccine. And importantly, we know that as a result, these clinical trials are all being monitored and studied carefully by medical authorities in different countries, such that safety as well as efficacy are both monitored and regulated and authorized before the vaccines are being rolled out for public use.
Thank you. And Neil, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Essentially, when people talk about trials taking 10 years to complete, most of that 10 years is absolutely nothing happening. And the difference is urgency and the amount of money put behind it. And they have been categorically different for COVID. But the trials themselves and the numbers of people in them are pretty much the same as they always are.
Thank you, Neil. Okay. So our next question is from Shirley. She is saying, so she said, hi, my husband felt restless around the heart area after having the Oxford vaccine. So maybe we can't answer that bit so much as it's an individual case. But she said, how effective is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine? And will I be limited with my lifestyle, like flying or going to the shops or doctors, if I don't get vaccinated?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that question's on a lot of people's mind. Maybe I can answer that. I mean, you're right, Ed. I think, individual cases of people's symptoms, etc. I think, we, as we said at the start, we really, speak with your GP, get some advice that way. That's the best thing to do. We can't really be going into individual cases. Is the Oxford vaccine effective? Yes, it is very, very effective. I mean, that's the case for all of the vaccines. I mean, not, it wasn't a given that these vaccines were going to be as effective as they are. And we have some diseases that we don't have vaccines for, and we've been trying to make them for 50 years. Malaria is a good example of that. Tuberculosis, we don't really have a good vaccine against that. I mean, the BCG, which many of us have had, is not a great vaccine by any stretch of the imagination. We haven't been able to make a good vaccine against HIV. So, there was a worry at the start of all this that we would, coronavirus might fall into that camp, and we would be very, where would we be if we had no vaccines? If we've got a scale of vaccines, they're really good at one end and the rubbish at the other end. All of the COVID vaccines are way up at the good end. I mean, they're right up the end, and there's really not a cigarette paper you can put between them in terms of their effectiveness. There's a real, they're all performing very similarly and very well. And importantly, I mean, what is it that we want to stop? As a community, we want to stop people going into hospital, dying, and having the serious complications of having severe COVID-19. And all of the vaccines are preventing those at a phenomenal rate. Of course, there will be, I'm sure, reports of people who have one of these vaccines and still end up in hospital. Sure, I'm sure that's going to happen. But if you look at the many millions of people that have been vaccinated and see, whether they've ended up in hospital, it's really been impressive. And I think if anybody really wants to see the best example of that is to look at Israel. And now Israel have essentially now, largely with the Pfizer vaccine, have largely vaccinated their entire adult population. They're well into the second dose for everybody, but almost everybody who's eligible has had a first jab. And they're seeing that their hospitalizations and their deaths right down, and the spread of the virus is right down. It's really very impressive. It's like a real-time experiment, and there are a lot of very interesting research papers coming out of Israel. So, yeah, all of the vaccines are very effective, and it's well worth everybody getting them, because it really does stop you getting a very nasty disease.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So no, that sounds very comprehensively answered.
Neil, do you have something I saw Neil's finger go up. Do you have anything to add there, Neil?
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to add to your point, Dan, about the vaccines and the sort of how effective they are, related to the blood clot point that we discussed earlier. That it's important to remember that there are no risk-free options here. People think about getting a vaccine and that being a blood clot risk, but we've discussed already how that risk is extremely small. And it's many times lower than the risk of actually getting blood clots from COVID itself. So and I think it was an important point to clarify that if there's anyone watching this who's had their first dose of one of the various vaccines, that there have been 0 cases of blood clots so far with anyone who's gone on to have their second dose. So we think that's very much a feature of when people have their first vaccine of whatever sort. And there have been no reports of that in people going back for their second jab. So if you're waiting for your second jab and you're a bit worried, there's really no need to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, so on next one, let's see if we can we've got 5 minutes left there. Should we see if we can get in a couple more questions? Next one from Rezwan is, will you have to get a yearly vaccine? Will you have to get a yearly vaccine?
I would like to have a go at answering that. Louisa, have a go. Yeah.
It's a very quick answer. I think we don't know yet. It's looking like a real possibility. I think it really depends how long the immunity that's created by the current vaccines last. And I think it's still a little bit early to say yet. But I mean, it's looking like it's a possibility. But we know that we can do that, right? We've done a great rollout in the UK, so I think it will be a real possibility if it's necessary. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's largely the case. We'll have to see, but I think it probably won't be like the influenza. I mean, influenza changes in a very, very specific way. It's a very different type of virus, and because of the way it can change year on year, that necessitates us to have a flu jab year on year. But influenza is very unusual in that respect, and it's not at all like the coronaviruses. So We may I think it's highly likely that we'll have another booster shot at some point in the future. It may be as quick as this autumn, if they can get themselves sorted out quickly enough, the vaccine companies. But it may well be that we get a booster shot next year sometime, and then we might, in future years, might need another booster at some point. It could well be something like that. I would say, if I was making a guess, an educated guess based on how the immune system functions against these types of viruses, I would say it's unlikely that we'll need one every year at this stage. But we, as Louisa said, it's something that will be closely monitored, and I think it's well within the capabilities of the scientific and medical communities to respond appropriately to what now we're set up to respond appropriately to whatever is needed in that respect.
Thanks. Okay, next one is from Lorna. She said, why are children who are not in danger of COVID-19 being trialled for some of the vaccines? Who would like to answer that one? So why are children who are not in danger of COVID-19 being trialled?
I mean, I can take that, if anybody, unless anybody else wants to have a shot at that. Naheed, Nitul, no. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think, thankfully, children haven't suffered too badly. I mean, there are cases of it occurring in children very seriously. Usually that's associated with a pre-existing condition. I think there is a concern with any sort of infectious disease that one of the easiest ways that it spreads around is through schools. And the reason why very small children are offered a flu jab each year is not because necessarily it doesn't really affect children that seriously. It affects flu affects babies quite badly, but not sort of 6, 7, 8-year-olds. But one of the reasons why we give the children the flu jab is to stop spreading. So I think there is a public health, angle on this, that it might well be good to safely vaccinate children as we safely vaccinate them against flu. But there is a possibility that a relatively small number of children can be badly affected with COVID-19. And of course, we've got this thing called long COVID, which, I think that's one of the areas where science is still trying to work out what that really is. And long COVID is this whole sort of mixture of different experiences that people who have been affected with COVID, and some of them quite mildly actually, but they've had greater than sort of 10 weeks. 10 weeks later they're still having significant symptoms, and they're sort of falling into sort of two categories. One, people still having respiratory problems and trouble with their chest and breathing and being very tired. But also there are other people who their chest may be largely okay, but they've got other organs involved. And I think we're still going to have to do a lot of careful research to work out what all this long COVID is and how it's being caused and who it's affecting. And one of the observations that long COVID seems to be something that children and young people do get. And there are quite a lot of cases that they may not get a particularly serious illness, but there's a lot of reports of people getting long COVID. So again, with that in mind, it might be a good idea to also have a vaccination program in children. Now, just to finish that point, when global communities first started making vaccines, of course, the urgency, as Jason said, the urgency with which you needed to deal with, you can make a vaccine to deal with this global pandemic. It really wasn't feasible to set up trials with children. We didn't know what we were dealing with. Of course, adults can volunteer for clinical trials, and many people, very selflessly did. And there's sort of the unspoken heroes of this, all the people who volunteered for testing these vaccines. And so you trial the vaccines in adults, and so you get your results from the trials about adults, and therefore you get authority to vaccinate adults. And that's why children are sort of are out of that equation. From the start of the year, we have, probably picked up on that, Lorna, that we have started trials of all the vaccines in children. I mean, they are, it's a much more difficult thing to do, because of course consenting children is very difficult, and those sorts of trials are, they proceed with extreme caution. But it's likely, given the initial results, that we should have, an approved set of vaccines for children. Probably, I mean, the estimate I read was by the autumn. Now, whether governments then choose to roll out those vaccines to children in quite the way they choose to do it, we'll have to wait and see. But it's a very good question about children. I think Ed and I started to do this by preparing some material for local schools, and I think the feedback we get from school children is, why are we not prioritized? Why are we being left out? Lots of questions like that, and it's a very sort of, it's not a straightforward situation to answer.
Thank you very much. And maybe one final question. It's from Jess. Well, here we go. How protected are you from COVID after you've had COVID compared to a vaccine? So how protected are you after having COVID compared to when you get the vaccine?
I think that's definitely one for Louisa or Neil. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So there's been a few studies now and looking into this from healthcare workers who were obviously kind of really badly hit by all of the waves of COVID-19. But the simple answer is that a vaccine will give you as good and in some cases better protection than natural infection. A vaccine gives you a very specific amount of the protein, the spike protein, that's required to induce the protective immunity that you need to maintain protection. Whereas with natural infection, depending on how well you cleared that infection, if you had a very mild infection, you may not have a very long-lasting response. There's a lot more variability there. So I think even if you've had COVID or think you've had COVID, there's a lot of advantage of having a vaccine, and it'll give you as good if not better protection.
Neil.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. As Louisa said, we think vaccines, if anything, look like they're going to give you even better immunity than catching this stuff naturally. One of the reasons we think that is that if you give someone a vaccine, you can give the useful bits of the virus with a load of junk cleared out of the way, so your immune system can get a really good look at it. And that's not quite the same as when you put in a virus and there's lots of different proteins and shapes and other things in the way. So it's much more difficult for the immune system to get a real grip on it. Whereas a vaccine, it makes that much, much easier for the immune system. So some people say, even just talking about the antibody bit, maybe that's 10 times better than just getting infected naturally. And we want those antibody levels nice and high for a really long time.
And I think the really important thing to add to that as well is that vaccines are sort of safe for the very, very vast majority of people, whereas your risk of disease, whether it's severe COVID, hospitalization, long COVID, which as Dan mentioned we really haven't got a very good grip on, your risk of getting sort of sick from natural infection is massively high, whereas when you compare that to vaccination, it's a sort of a no-brainer.
And Ed, perhaps I can just sort of maybe finish off by sort of going back to what I said right at the start, and that because I think that's a really nice question again, to think back about how the immune system works and how the vaccines work. And I think Louisa and Neil both mentioned that the vaccines, we've been giving people vaccines since the 1700s, since the days Ed Jenner and with smallpox. So it's something that we've worked a lot on as a scientific community. And when we deliver those vaccines, as I think Louisa said, we deliver just the right amount to just the right place, so that we maximize the chances of finding those limited numbers of useful cells and having that protein, that component of the virus around for long enough to actually identify them and also to induce them to make lots and lots of copies. When we have natural infection, we might be lucky enough that the level of infection and the speed with which we clear it also gives you the sort of optimal conditions for finding the cells and making the response. But if, as I think Neil said, if you've been, or Louisa, if you've been really good at actually clearing out the infection really quickly, I mean, maybe the virus just didn't take a hold for many reasons. Maybe there was a very small amount of virus. Maybe you're genetically, you're a bit better at fighting it with the very first barriers. You know, you might not really have generated enough of the virus to really select all the cells. And so that process may have sort of happened, and you've got a few cells expanded up, and that was enough to clear the virus, but it wasn't really optimal in terms of protecting you in the future. So of course, in real life, you know, before we had medicines and vaccines and stuff, people were exposed repeatedly to similar infections, especially childhood infections. And each time you're exposed, it sort of tops up and boosts and reinforces those initial responses. And so after a few exposures, you've really got sort of top level of immunity. And the vaccines are generally better at getting to that top level of immunity more consistently in more people than, you know, the vagaries and the heterogeneous nature of natural infection.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan. And I think that really did answer that very well, to be honest. It's very interesting. Right, so I guess we have gone over a little bit, but it was, you know, fascinating hearing all the answers to questions. So I think it was well worth it. Just like to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists tonight. It's been really, really informative. Lots of amazing questions has been answered by our audience tonight as well. We will consider obviously doing future sessions like this, so please stay tuned to wherever you found out about this session the first time. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for your questions. Bye.